One of the things we know in the financial crime world, just as in cybersecurity and defence, we have data scientists working against us actively on the other side. So if there is too much data out there about how we're doing things that they can then test against, all of a sudden they'll change their typologies. And we might have built models that work beautifully against all the known typologies, but then they'll switch and then they'll suddenly become less useful.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world. I'm your host Fredrik Riiser, Head of Strategy and Business Development at Strise, and in this episode we're asking, is synthetic data shaking up financial crime and compliance? Synthetic data and its capabilities have arrived with all sorts of hype. It's the next great accelerator, the silver bullet of compliance, an emerging hero. But while the promise is here, there is still plenty to be fulfilled from this technology. In today's episode, I'm here with a great guest to strip away the hype and discuss what are the capabilities of synthetic data today, what are the biggest challenges in its way, and what could the future look like if we get this right. To dive into the topic, I'm here with Dr. Janet Bastiman, Chief Data Scientist at Napier AI. Welcome to The Laundry, Janet. Can you tell our listeners more about you, your background, and Napier AI?
It's a pleasure to be here. Absolutely. So I have been coding for 4 decades now. Did my PhD at the turn of the century, and I've been working on complex data problems for the past 25 years. For the past 4 years, I've been Chief Data Scientist at Napier, as you said, and we're a regulatory technology firm and provide intelligent solutions to help financial institutions manage their compliance, so screening, sort of transaction monitoring, and all of that sort of AML side in a really intelligent way. We want to make it easy and efficient and effective. And me and my team, we build AI solutions that help achieve that. I'm also chair of the Royal Statistical Society's Data Science and AI section. So I'm working with universities, non-profits and government to help define what good looks like in terms of AI and data science. And I'm also part of the Financial Conduct Authority's Synthetic Data Expert Group. And we've done a few publications recently just to highlight how synthetic data can help.
Thank you for the introduction. I think for full transparency, we're lucky at Strise to be working with Napier AI on a strategic partnership, which will cover the end-to-end value chain of anti-money laundering service. And there's more to come on that news pretty soon. But I think let's just start off from the very top and dive into today's topic. So maybe Janet, if you could explain to me, like I'm 5 years old, what do we mean by synthetic data?
Okay, so very simply, synthetic data is artificial data. It's made up for a specific purpose. And that could be to test the boundaries of whatever system you're putting it into, or it could be as a replacement for real data where you can't use that real data for data privacy issues, or maybe you just don't have access to that data. Either it can't be taken off its system or there's just not enough of it. So sort of in a nutshell, it's something that we've created to solve a problem.
And how do you go about generating and creating this synthetic data?
So with great care, there's a couple of ways of doing it. I mean, the first thing, you've really got to understand the shape and nature of your real data. Because if you're creating something without that knowledge, then you're making it up based on your own assumptions and biases, which may or may not be right. So you've really got to start with understanding that scope. So as a really, really trivial example, if you're putting income into a field and you're generating that, where is the midpoint? Where's the distribution of that income? You don't want everyone to be at zero, and similarly, you don't want, near infinite amounts if you're trying to model reality. So you need to put some sort of caveats around that data. But you also really need to understand interdependencies as well. And so again, income versus expenditure, those will be balanced for a normal person. So looking at that and what your assumptions are is really important straight off. And if you've got some real data to start with, then that gives you your starting point. But then you need to be careful that that sample data is actually representative. And there's a lot of statistics that I could throw out around minimum sample sizes and understanding the bias in that sampling to make sure that you've really got something good and you're not overly moved by outliers in your data, or even if they are outliers, or are they just a rare example in your sample. So all of that needs to be done up front. And then once you know that, you can start creating. And there's a couple of ways to do this. You can do it procedurally. So if you know what your boundaries are, then you might want to just write a simple script to say, okay, it needs to be within this range and it needs to be related to another field so that they're correlated. Although more recently, people are using various generative AI techniques to create that data for them. And it can be as easy as asking some of these online services to give you 1,000 lines with certain sort of characteristics. But again, once you've generated it, you need to test that it matches your assumptions up front.
And that's really speaking to the value proposition of why this makes sense from a financial crime perspective. The way that I'm reading it is as this actually allows for companies to start sharing more of this data, since you don't have to use the real data. That means it's no data privacy issues, and especially for hypothetically a small local financial institution that have very limited sample data to start with, they could then utilize some of this synthetic data to test their models. Is that sort of the correct assumption, or how do you view it?
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. One of the great things about synthetic data is it does bypass the data privacy issue. Although if you are creating it based on a small sample of real data and using that as a seed for generation, you do need to do that reverse check to make sure you can't get back to the real data. But it does get over that, which means that, one, we can do a lot more sharing, exactly as you said, because there's very few publicly available data sets in the financial crime space that we can actually use for these models. And those that are quite old. So it's really important that we can have other options. And when you're talking about sort of small companies that have maybe limited data sets using it, absolutely. But, and I'm probably going to refer to this a lot, they need to check that, they have a small data set, so they have a limited sample. So are the things that they're checking represented in that sample? And they might need to create a larger data set and then seed that with some specific examples of certain typologies they might be interested in or certain things that they want to test. So it's not just as easy as a quick, ask GPT, generate me data.
How far away do you think we are from publicly available frameworks with these type of synthetic data sets that maybe regulatory bodies would be able to provide as training data for models?
I don't think technologically we're far away at all. I think what we need to consider is more the boundaries of those data sets, because if we create a data set that contains all of the known financial crime typologies and you can test against it, that's great, but we need to be quite restrictive over who has access to that, because one of the things we know in the financial crime world, just as in cybersecurity and defense, we have data scientists working against us actively on the other side. So if there is too much data out there about how we're doing things that they can then test against, then all of a sudden they'll change their typologies. And we might have built models that work beautifully against all the known typologies, but then they'll switch and then they'll suddenly become less useful because all of the typologies would have changed overnight.
And maybe if you could briefly explain to the listeners as well what you mean with typologies and how does that affect the different type of scenarios and models that you train for?
Okay, so a typology is simply a definition about how a financial crime occurs. So it might be as simple as saying that a large amount of cash into an account is quickly followed by a large amount of cash out of the account. This is an unusual behaviour and needs to be investigated, and that's probably one of the most simplest. So when we're looking at this, there are hundreds of these different typologies that describe different types of financial crime for different, whether it's an individual or companies, and whether it involves multiple individuals or just one individual, and all sorts of different types of money movement. So all of these need to be encapsulated in the data set so that you can then test your models against them. And if that's too exposed, then, I mean, we know new ones are being created all the time, but there will be new ways that the money gets moved that we won't be able to detect because it's not in the data set.
Perfect. And maybe you can provide some practical examples as to how synthetic data is being utilized by financial institutions already. What type of project have you seen, and have you seen any results that are promising in the way people are applying these type of models over the last few years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are some examples in the publication from the FCA on synthetic data that came out earlier this year. But I mean, from my own point of view, we're using it heavily internally at Napier because our customer data is kept in our secure customer environments. So when we're developing models, we have to think, okay, what do we want to test on? And it might just be as simple as we need to create billions of transactions in order to test throughput. It might be, okay, we need to put a couple of needles in that haystack. So specific groups of transactions that maybe amount to a typology. So something where we know the truth before we then test our models on it. So that's really helpful because a lot of the time when you're looking at real data, it's messy and you don't know whether something is a suspicious transaction or whether it's real. And in my world, we don't always have that answer. We might be able to say it looks like it, but we never get that feedback to say whether it is or not. So having a system where we can say definitively, this transaction has been designed to be picked up, and was it picked up further down the line is really, really useful. And I know that my colleagues sort of across the board, whether in banks or competitors, are using it in similar ways.
How far along have we got now in the evolution of utilizing synthetic data? Obviously, there's a big resurgence happening with generative AI really sparking the utilization of AI and machine learning and artificial models utilized in combating financial crime. How much of an effect have that had on the evolution of synthetic data, would you say?
I think it's been huge because it's made it very easy to generate. I mean, there's always been tools around that would help you generate data, and quite a lot of companies did it themselves based on what they knew. So, going back to, I said earlier about the procedural way of generating it. So you set your boundaries for each field and how they're related, and then just generate line by line. And that's fine, and you can do that and you have a lot of control over it. But what generative AI gives us is some very, very fast mock data. So if you want to check that your system's okay, then you can get that in really, really quickly. What you do need to have caution with, though, is to make sure that generated data is completely applicable to your world. So the types of transactions that you're looking at, and making sure that it does encapsulate the behaviors that you want to see. And this is some of the things, because sort of financial crime data isn't publicly available. A lot of these big public generative AIs, the LLMs, haven't been trained on it. So they're making it up based on their assumptions as to what transactional data looks like. And these big models don't tell you what those assumptions are. So you kind of can use it for testing, but you need to have more analyzed data in order to validate your systems.
And this is where you can combine the LLMs with the synthetic data to provide better results, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So have that large amounts of completely randomly generated data and then seed it with your known data. I mean, you could say that they're both just different types of synthetic data, and you can even get the LLMs to generate you the script to generate your synthetic data, which makes your life even easier. And then you can adjust it to make sure that it's within the bounds and the parameters that you want as well. So it's a really helpful tool. The one word of caution I would say is that if you have real data, then you want to have a local LLM rather than sending all of that real data over the internet to be used by something else, because that'll almost certainly be in contravention of the data protection rules.
Absolutely, I think that's a great tip for everybody looking into utilizing LLMs to combat financial crime, utilizing any sort of internal data. What would you say is the biggest challenges or limitations associated with the use of synthetic data now in 2024?
I think for me, the challenge is are really around understanding the relevancy and the shape and the characteristics of that synthetic data. Because even if you have real data, you're still looking at a sample, and understanding whether that sample is representative or not is a really important step. So when you're generating the synthetic data, you may feel like you've got a good sample of, say, normality, but you might need to deliberately include a lot of your edge cases, either to make sure that your system handles them correctly, that it alerts correctly on outliers, or even that it can learn certain behaviors. And one of the things that I see very regularly is that a lot of the typologies of money laundering, so the way in which money launderers move their money through accounts, overlaps considerably with some of the most marginalised in our society. So, the people who are maybe working 3 or 4 cash in hand, 0 hours jobs, and as soon as they get money into account, they have to take it out to pay bills, to put money on their gas meter. So it's cash in, cash out very, very quickly. And if your model doesn't learn that that's a viable behavior, then it can easily flag those up. And if that's all fully automated, before you know it, you've had a really bad PR disaster where you've blocked an awful lot of vulnerable people's accounts. So it's really important when you're using synthetic data to understand the full scope of the world in which your model is going to be working in.
And how do we go about actually setting up testing programs or making sure we set up rules to filter out those type of assumptions or results that the models trained on synthetic data might come up with?
I mean, part of that's actually having a good testing pipeline. So having a good analysis of the real data that you've got and a good analysis of the results that are coming out. So not just looking at raw accuracy, what are your false positives, false negatives, how much do your predictions deviate? Because, they're all metrics, but it's never going to be 100%. So what is the impact of that small percentage, and really analyze those? It's one of those things that I think most people who aren't deep into statistics tend to just brush over, because 95% sounds amazing, but that's still 1 in 20 is wrong. And if you think about the impact of that, I always use the example that if you're thinking about a weather forecast and it's 95% accurate, you might be a bit upset, but you wouldn't be too bothered if you carried an umbrella and you didn't need it, or you got a bit rained on. But if it's something critical, like, wearing a blindfold and crossing a road, and I tell you when to go, and it's like, well, 1 in 20 times you're going to get hit by a car, you probably wouldn't take those odds. So really understanding what is the impact of that 5%, and that's where you need to spend your time. But also, one of the things that I advocate for is having that real diversity of thought in your team. And a lot of financial institutions will only hire from certain universities and only hire people that have done internships and jobs at certain big banks. And while those people will have all the characteristics they're looking for, they will have been taught to think in a certain way, and they're probably from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. So going back to the example of the person on, the 0 hours contract who has to put money on their gas card, that's something that if you don't know anyone that has a prepayment, electricity or gas meter, it might not even occur to you that someone has to do that, because most of us pay by direct debit and just don't think about it. But having that input, so you say, actually, different people use money in different ways. This is actually normal for a lot of the population, is absolutely critical. And you only get that with teams that have got those different backgrounds.
We're moving more and more towards automation because it drives efficiency, which in many ways drive profit, which at the end of the day is very important for small and big companies. Are you worried that these type of models will completely take over and set up a society where human intervention isn't even thought of, because the people that marginalized aren't necessarily the most profitable customers either way, so you don't have to really take care?
I am worried that will happen, because I think you're right. A lot of companies are looking purely at the costs, whereas what this gives us, and I think this is true of AI across the board, is it's an augmentation. It allows us to do the boring, repetitive parts of our jobs much faster, so that we can focus on the bits that are that require creativity, that require human insight. And when you have companies that are looking to replace rather than to improve, that is always going to be a problem, because you're moving that clear human understanding and all of that training, because the automation is very much at the lower levels. So how are we going to get the experts to keep the human in the loop? And what we are seeing from a regulatory point of view is pretty much worldwide that requirement for a human in the loop to make that final judgment. So if the AI is presenting results, that person has to understand how those results were obtained. So as we automate more, we need that clear explainability, but we also need to make sure that we're preserving the education and the understanding of the human agents so that they can rise up to these positions to make that decision.
There is a lot of talk about AI hallucinations. What is an AI hallucination, and what is people getting right and wrong about the AI hallucinations?
This is something that really upsets me, because we're calling it hallucination and it's basically just a fluffy marketing term to say wrong. So when we're looking at, our AI models, we have lots and lots of different accuracy metrics. We're looking at mean squared errors, and we're looking at, what's our false positive to false negative ratios and all of these things. And yet when it comes to large language models, when they get things blatantly wrong, we call it hallucination to make us feel happy about it. And one of the things that I say an awful lot is, if you get 50% in an exam, it's not that you got 50% right and you hallucinated 50% and that's okay. You barely passed it because you got 50% wrong. And we need to normalize ignoring the word hallucination and saying wrong or inaccurate. Because quite often when these models are, for example, explainability of how they got to a certain answer, they will make something up and it will be wrong. So when we can really trust these models is really important. And that hallucination problem, it's a problem because we're calling it hallucination. We need to call it out for what it is.
In today's fast-paced world, financial crime can occur in mere minutes or even seconds. But what if you could spend just 15 minutes learning how to more effectively stop it? Prepare yourself and your company for the future of AML with the Q from Strise. Join us for a 15-minute live stream. In this high-speed pit stop, you can find out about constantly updated AML data that meets all current and future regulations, features that slash the manual tasks that bog down your AML team, making your operations smoother and more efficient, and a product solution that solves the crucial problem of scattered and disconnected AML data. Join us online on Thursday, June 20th at 11 a.m. Central European Time. Find the link in the episode show notes now and don't miss out.
I think we should move into the part of looking at how synthetic data will be utilized in the future. So if everything falls into place with all the right regulations and development happening, what do you think synthetic data would provide us? What does the synthetic data space look like in 5 years' time?
Well, I'm hoping that by then we'll have overcome some of the hurdles around access to kind of a generic synthetic data pot that has all of those typologies in it, so that we can do that fast turnaround and testing of models. I'd like it to be a way that whenever something new is detected, there's that wonderful fast feedback loop. So as soon as you see something new and suspicious, once it's validated quickly, it becomes part of that pot and it's there so that we can adapt and change as fast as the people that we're trying to detect are adapting and change. I'd love us to get to that point as soon as possible, and having that sharing from all the financial institutions, ideally worldwide, so that we could get all of that information together in a way that's, conforms to data privacy while still retaining that realism of, the data that we see day in, day out, so that we can, have an absolutely rapid turnaround, so we can build new models and get them into production almost as quickly as, we're having these conversations with the LLMs at the moment to generate some dummy data for us in the first place.
And how do you think the criminals are adapting? And what's your biggest worry about how they will utilize synthetic data moving forward?
I think they're probably using it in exactly the same way that we are. I think they're putting together, new typologies, trying new things. I think they probably have their own detectors. And I also think that they're probably trying and pushing new things out with some quite lower level financial crime, things that they're not afraid to lose so that they can see where we are, because it's exactly the same way in which cyber criminals operate, is that you probe the boundaries looking for weakness, and then when you find one you go in. And I believe that they're doing exactly the same thing, and they'll be utilizing synthetic data in the same way that I do, because they will have their own data scientists and they're extremely well funded and motivated, so there'll be people using every tool available to achieve their own aims. And it's a real concern, because obviously they're not restricted by doing the right thing, being ethical, and all of the regulations, so can move even faster than we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the regulations, what are the conversations that the regulators are having these days around utilizing synthetic data?
It's very positive. They're seeing it as a way to share information, share innovation, and also comply with all of the other rules and regulations outside of the finance industry that we need to manage. So there's a very positive feel there. I think it's mainly around having the time in the financial institutions to use it properly and making sure that they can get the most out of it. But that will come.
Why should a small to medium-sized financial institution or any sort of regulated company care about synthetic data? What are the practical applications that they should get excited about?
I think the main one is that ability to try things out, have that sandbox in your own environment of data that's representative, that might be more than you can access directly, so that you can push forward new models, new ideas, see where things may or may not work, and also make sure that your whole system is working properly, because as test data it's phenomenal, and you can we've talked about synthetic data being a good match for real data, but you can also create synthetic data that's right at the boundaries, that's maybe completely outside of what your system's set up to handle, to make sure it handles it correctly. So it's an absolutely powerful tool, and particularly the smaller you are, the more useful it will be, because you just don't have the resources to maybe get the real data or even create it in a more procedural way.
Because what could be the real world consequences of getting the use of synthetic data right?
Well, I think if we get it right, then we can just build and innovate faster. And at the moment, we do have some issues, just because it's really, really difficult to properly identify all of the nuances of real data. There is so much variability. And when you're looking at the real data, for example, that I see, it's very limited in terms of it's just the transaction. So we don't know what else might have been going on in that individual's life in order to make that transaction at that time, at that day, for that amount. So when you're looking at the things that might flag up, all of a sudden there's some big purchases. And if I look at my own history, quite a few years ago, my husband's 40th birthday, I bought him an expensive watch that I'd been saving up for, and we went out and we had a very expensive, night out in a few hotels, and we spent a lot of money out, on champagne. And all of that very suddenly, after, I'm normally quite frugal with my money, flagged up, and quite rightly so. Whereas the information that was missing was that it was a family member's significant birthday. And of course the models won't learn that, because that's not my information. That's information about someone related to me. So all of those things are missing. But what we can do is we can build a much richer ecosystem of all of these transactions and the information, and pull it all together, and then start looking at some of these nuances, and then filter in on, actually, this is normal and this is not normal, in a way that is a lot easier than just looking at lines and lines of raw transactions.
And potentially making it more accessible for more institutions that didn't have that type of data available before.
Absolutely. Because if you just not got it, where do you start? And, up till now, you've kind of had to, say, make it up based on what you think and what you know, and then just hope that you've got it right because you can't check against anything. Whereas if we had a sort of centralized data set that we knew was valid, that had some specific examples of financial crime in, but mostly was just normal data, it just means you can get on, you can try things and innovate quickly. And that's what we need to do in order to progress in this space.
I really hope we get to the point where regulated bodies could provide those type of data sets fairly soon for financial institutions and regulated companies to test. I think you summed it up really nicely with those sentences, Janet. We're approaching the end of the episode, but we do have a segment where we dish out some quickfire questions. So are you ready?
Okay, go for it.
Can you describe synthetic data in one sentence?
Artificial, made-up data that's fit for a purpose.
What is the biggest challenge in implementing synthetic data models successfully?
Understanding what's real data so that you know that the synthetic data matches it.
Would you say artificial intelligence is a benefit or a problem for compliance professional?
Huge benefit if it's used correctly.
And lastly, can synthetic data shake up financial crime and compliance, or is this just hype?
It can do, but with the same caveat, if used correctly.
Thank you so much. That brings the spin of the laundry to an end. Janet, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more and connect with you?
Well, my company website is Napier AI, so you can find all about what we do there. Also, I am very easy to find on socials. My LinkedIn is Janet Bastiman. I believe I am the only one in the world. My social media is slightly different. It was a handle I've had since university, so it on both X and Mastodon, I'm Isabel, which is YSSYBYL, but it comes up with the same photo as LinkedIn, so you'll know it's me.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels. Tell your colleagues about it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really does help people find us. Got a story that you think deserves The Laundry's treatment? You can comment on Strise's LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Fredrik. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Niklas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Your data problem and your workflow problem now isn't your problem. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Money makes a world go round.